Spring returns. The days grow longer, the air gets softer, and after a long and unnecessary hibernation, a stubborn model builder begins to stir. For many months, the machine has sat undisturbed. Dust settles. Tools rest. CAD files remain open, but untouched. And yet, with the first signs of warmth, something remarkable happens. He remembers the Gullwing doors still don't work.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Before anyone asks where I've been, no, I didn't quit. I just made the very smart decision to juggle a full-time job, a master's thesis, 2 small businesses, an apartment that still needed work after moving, and this absolutely unreasonable car. People sometimes ask me, Lucas, how do you manage all of that? And the answer is, with a round-robin system, you just rotate between tasks and always work on whatever needs attention next. Except in my case, it feels less like round-robin and more like looping Louis, and I'm the one drunk in a corner. Also, it was freezing in the garage, and somehow sitting in front of a computer in a warm room felt slightly more attractive than losing circulation in my hands for scale accuracy. When I left off, I was right in the middle of what I can only describe as a deeply personal argument with the power windows. The plan was simple. New gear motors, new brackets, clean up the pulley bearings, reduce friction, make the windows go up and down like a civilized person. So I designed and printed new motor mounts, cleaned the bearings, gave them a bit of WD-40, put everything back together, and it still didn't work. Even with a 1:90 reduction and more voltage, the motors just didn't have enough torque to turn the spools properly. Which is impressive because at that point the system wasn't even lifting actual glass yet, just my disappointment. I was pretty sure the steel cable was still too stiff and the spool diameter was probably too small, so the whole thing was asking for more torque than this tiny drivetrain could ever deliver. Then a buddy of mine suggested using fishing line instead of steel cable, and that actually helped, which is great, because I had finally solved the problem. That was encouraging for about 4 seconds. At this point I was optimistic, which should have worried me. The next problem was geometry. The brass guide for the white window holders was curved, but the microfiber lined guide frames were basically straight, which meant the window was being forced through a path that made absolutely no mechanical sense. So instead of sliding freely, everything was bending, twisting, rubbing and loading up the mechanism in the dumbest possible way. So I did what every reasonable person does after a long technical failure. I took the whole thing apart again. The brass guide rods came out, the old guide frame got ripped out, I redesigned and printed a new one with a consistent profile, and I removed the travel limit switches for now just to reduce variables and keep the mechanism as simple and free as possible. Then I added a new guide rod in the B-pillar, making sure it was actually parallel where it needed to be. Because the guide rod still couldn't be built parallel all the way toward the window frame, I designed and printed little hinges to compensate for the angle between the guide and the frame. In theory, these were supposed to let the window move smoothly without radial play. In practice, this looked promising right up until it absolutely wasn't. And then there was the gearbox. To assemble it, I had to place the final gear inside the housing, close the gearbox, align the output shaft with the gear hub, hit the bore in the housing as a second bearing point, and apply microscopic amounts of Loctite while doing all of that. Eventually I got to the point where I had to admit something very annoying. Even if I got the windows to move, I still couldn't close the door. The mechanism was technically moving, just not in a helpful way. And that was the moment I knew this feature was dead. At least for now. I spent a good while arguing with myself about that, because I'd already put way too much time into it. I mean, I've been working on those doors since November 2023. That's 2.5 years. You know that stage in a project where you're no longer making decisions, you're just trying to emotionally justify previous decisions? That. So I did the major thing, sat in the sun with a glass of wine, went through the 5 stages of grief, And then I accepted that the electrically adjustable windows were not worth sacrificing the entire door for. Sometimes progress means solving the problem, and sometimes it means dragging the problem behind the garage and ending it with the shovel. Every time I solved one issue, the door generated a new one out of spite. The windows themselves are also not going in yet. The final accent paints will only be slid into the slot once the whole car is much further along. Which is good, because I would really prefer not to scratch them while I'm still sanding half the vehicle like a maniac. So the power windows are gone. Not because I lost, but because I would quite like to finish this car before retirement. Honestly, the second I stopped trying to save the windows, the whole project started moving again. I could finally focus on making the doors actually fit, actually close, and actually look like the real thing. First, I worked on the inner contours of the door frame, cutting the printed contour pieces into smaller sections so I could position them accurately from the inside. That let me glue everything in place at stages, with the door closed where necessary, then remove it again and reinforce the joints properly. Then I had to machine a groove all the way around the frame so the outer contour of the door would sit flush with the body. Easy, right? Just buy a grooving bit. Except there's no such thing as a milling grooving bit. I spent a week searching and got nothing. So I built the tool myself. And you know what? It actually worked. That part felt great. Then I moved on to the latch bracket. I quickly realized I didn't have the material that would survive more than about 3 locking cycles without snapping, so I modeled it in CAD and had it printed in steel. And when that part arrived, I have to admit, I was slightly offended by how good it looked. And once the doors started behaving structurally, I could finally get into the fun part. Tiny details that take forever and make almost nobody normal. The door handles were calibrated so that the light put will actually unlock the door once they had extended. The mirror blinkers got their own little lighting setup with tiny SMD LEDs mounted onto custom curved strips so they could actually follow the shape of the mirror housing, which sounds elegant now, but the mirrors also still aren't actually finished. Right now the blinker setup works, but the mirrors still need paint and the actual mirror glass. So at the moment they're less completed exterior part and more a convincing argument. The wiring for the mirrors and the door handle servo went through the structure, connectors were added so everything could still come apart later, threaded inserts went into the door panel, and the inner door trim slowly turned into actual interior parts instead of just shaped plastic. I also started adding all the little controls and trim pieces that make the doors feel properly scaled. Window switches, mirror controls, lock pins, speaker inserts, carbon trim, airbag cover, fake stitching. Nobody will notice this immediately, which is exactly why it matters. At this point I was basically manufacturing the world's least efficient luxury interior. The stitching in particular turned out way better than I expected. And yes, I went with white on purpose. Because with the black interior, the real car basically gave me 2 sensible options. White or red stitching. Red does exist, but it belongs more to the Black Series variant, and with a yellow car that would have been a bit too much. So I'm keeping the whole thing to 3 main colors, yellow, black and white. That makes the white stitching the cleanest and most believable choice for this interior. To fake it, I used thin foam sheet, scratched a groove into it with a toothpick, laid white thread into that groove with spray adhesive, and suddenly it looked way more like proper stitch trim than it had any right to. Which is nice, because now I'll probably be redoing more of the interior like that, including the dashboard. Remember that, it becomes important later. Then I rebuilt the fake gas struts, because apparently fake parts on this car also need to be engineered like real ones. Each side got proper ball ends, printed adapters, brass tubes, little O-rings and a spring setup inside a larger tube so the whole thing actually has a preload and behaves like a proper support strut when the door is open. At one point I also realized I accidentally made this way more real than intended. I knew they were better the moment I compared them to the old ones. But after all that, the result was worth it. The new fake struts work beautifully, the door contours were finished, sanded and primed, and for the first time in a very long time, the doors actually started to feel finished. This is probably the most important distinction in the whole video. The doors are now working properly in the ways that matter structurally, but they are nowhere near fully finished. There's still no pin yet to trigger the door contact for the interior lighting. The upholstery and soft trim still need to be added, and a lot of final surface work still needs to happen. And none of that actually makes sense before paint, because paint only happened after I put in a frankly unreasonable amount of sanding, fillers, reshaping and general elbow grease across the whole body. So yes, the doors are finally becoming real, but finished? Not even close.